Okay, now I'm making a video. Can you please be quiet? This is a video about how to do an analysis of a system that includes battery and solar and how to compare it against a uh, grid, grid power, and also self-generation from diesel power. Now, the case I'm going to study is simply a retail case where you just put this on your house. So you have, and this seems to be happening a lot more in Nigeria, which is really fascinating. And that is the people in Nigeria, to get around all of these problems with the electricity, they're starting to put solar plus battery. They have a grid backup. I mean, gasoline or petrol backup, and they also can buy from the grid. It's almost like they have a dispatch center in their house. Now, I've made a couple of other videos on batteries, and I tend to get very complicated. This time, I'm going to show you how to make a simple kind of payback period and use a payback function. And I'm also going to introduce some new ideas or issues with generic macros. So I'm going to show you use of a payback UDF function, and if we have, look at here, ones and zeros when we replace the battery. I'm going to show you a little bit how to do this new section of the generic macros where it will find the ones and zeros and color them differently. That's extremely important, making your colors. Now, to introduce this, I think it's really helpful to work through. Again, I'm going to first use a little bit of the generic macros. I'm good, and perhaps, this one man told me, don't ever show the grid lines, as if that's such a big deal. We're going to go through kind of all the inputs you need. Now, there are a lot of these inputs that you can see, even for a simple kind of case. And what I'm going to do is after we do this, work through a whole kind of tornado diagram to see which inputs make the biggest difference and which make the smallest difference. Excuse me. I'm going to go through kind of how you can buy a dry acid, not a lithium battery, which is what they seem to use, what the retail rates are, what the diesel prices are, what the solar yields are, what the diesel heat rates are. And those are some of all the inputs, just to make a little analysis for your house, and whether you should use a payback function or an IRR function. I'm going to do this all on a pre-tax basis. Now, perhaps before we get started, I'm just going to introduce another thing I've been working on that I put on the on my website. So I think if you go to my website, if you go to energy analysis, and then you go to batteries and storage analysis, and then you go to modeling the battery cost in the operation, you'll be able to download a file here. And I'll put this file I'm working on there as well. And then in this case, I said, okay, well, we could have, it doesn't show it up here, a wind project, a solar project, and a battery. And we can put a little check box for whether they're operational. So we can put a battery in or take it out, put wind in, take it out, or we can buy from the grid. Now, oops, I missed a screenshot there. The key to doing this, and the key to doing any of this, is to understand how much you what your strategy is going to be in charging and discharging the battery and how you're going to use it. Now, in this case, I made a very simple example that we have kind of a flat load, a 24-hour load, very simple load, but the hourly patterns are different for the wind and the solar. So the question is, what are you going to do? And this is for a day. Here's our solar for the day. Here's our wind for the day. This was a day when we had both solar and wind. And I think you got to set up this hour, do a lot of hourly by hour analysis. And ultimately, when you do the hour by hour analysis, you want to make almost, it's like a debt balance. You want to see how much power is stored in the battery and when you're going to discharge it. So the reason I put all of these peak prices and on-peak prices, off-peak prices is we can only charge the battery during the off-peak times and only discharge the batteries during the on-peak times. That's one way to do that. There are a whole host of other ways, and it irritates the heck out of me. It really does. This goddamn, let's use some AI to do this bullshit. It's an if statement, and you got to think through how would you actually operate the battery, and then so this is an illustration on an hour by hour basis how you might charge it and discharge it, and it's a simple if statement. We're going to discharge it when we have it. We're going to charge it when we're not full up. You're not going to charge the battery when you're already full, of course, although some people seem to charge their phones every single day when they don't need to and all that crap. And then you're going to discharge the battery when you not during the off-peak times when power is cheap. You're going to discharge the power during the on-peak times. And this all depends on how much solar and how much wind you're producing. So here are a couple of other graphs. You can go through this thing and just look at the graphs. And then finally, you make your model and you put, how much, if you put your battery in, how much will your off-peak sales and on-peak purchases and on-peak sales change? It's not so complicated. Maybe I made it look a little complicated. And then I've got some more stuff here, and then I put a whole financial model together on that. Okay, so that's a different kind of battery analysis. Okay, and the trick is really figuring out what strategy you're going to use. Now, let's move to this much more. It's not a more simple analysis in a way, but and in a way you really need all of these. So what I'm going to do now is kind of work through some of the assumptions quickly with you, and you need the same sort of, even if it's for one little house, not a little house, maybe, I don't know how big the house was, but one house. And here are some of the parameters I was given for a real case in a house. So I start with how the whole system cost $8,600, and then the battery system cost $2,600. Maybe this really should have been, no, that's okay. And the battery consisted of 8 batteries, and each battery cost 325 USD. Now these batteries, excuse me, I'm going to go to a little data book. I think these models have something called a data book. Now I just clicked and said, oh, was this man, was he telling me correctly? And here's a lead acid battery, and here's how much, here's the amps and the voltage, and they kind of multiplied them together to get the kilowatt hours. And they say this life cycle in the best case is only 250 cycles, which is nothing because there's 365 cycles in it. If you use it every single day, that'd be, I think there are 365 or 366 days in a year. So determining the battery life is a really big deal. Now, the person who I was working with says, no, this battery's going to last longer. So, okay, we can put it in, but we'll make I put 5 years, so we'll put a sensitivity analysis in here. And then, now if you put the batteries plus the solar in, then I just subtracted the cost of the batteries from the total cost of the system to get the cost of just the solar. And here's the big deal. Apparently, the inverter had 7 kilovolts of capacity, and I put a capacity. I put a power factor in, and I'm not sure some engineer's going to correct me on this. But then I get the total kilowatts that are produced, and then we can divide the cost of the battery by the kVA, or we can divide it by the kW. If the power factor is 1, then we get um, about 800 USD per kW. Now, if the power factor is 0.85, then we get a total, and I might have to correct this power factor. I'm admitting this is not my strength. We get a cost per watt, and people seem to use how many USD per watt it is rather than USD per kilowatt. And now I'm not going to open some files, but this disgusts me. In projects in the US, this number is typically 3. And if you go to my website and you go and you do something that I'm sure nobody does, and it really makes me sad, but if you go to this page up here called databases, and then down on the bottom of the page there's something called solar costs, and what you can do is scrape this website called PV Insights, and when you scrape it, it puts it in a whole new sheet. And after you put it in a whole new sheet, you can see what's happened to the cost of a panel itself, which is the centerpiece. And this, I haven't continued, but they've come down to below 200 USD. So when you say that, or that's 20 cents, 20 US cents per watt. And when I see these things of 3,000 per kilowatt or 3 cents when the cost of the panel itself is 0.2. I know your friend Donald Trump put the tariffs on, so maybe you can't get all that savings, but whatever. Why is it so dramatically different? Okay, so that's our total cost, and then we go to the solar inputs and we look at then I'm just focusing kind of, I'm repeating in a way what I said. He was going to put 20 panels in, and each panel had 300 watt capacity. So the total capacity was 6,000 watts or 6 kilowatts, which is just corresponds to our how much power we actually get out from the inverter. Okay, all right, that's the first thing we do. And then the excuse me, I'm trying to get some words out. I'm trying to say, well, what happens if we really assume the cost of the panel was 200? How much is the implied balance of the system cost? Okay, it would be the total cost of the solar minus the panel cost. And the panel cost was 200 times the 20 panels. Okay, and we can see what the balance of the system cost is. And finally, then, of course, as in any solar analysis, you need some kind of yield analysis. Now I've got a little PV cyst here, and for this PV cyst, it's actually in a nearby kind of place. They give you a yield of 1,300. Now, if you see a yield like that of kWh per kW, that kWh, forget the P, it's like kWh divided by kW, and for the annual period, that's 1,377. So the first thing I do, if I'm used to looking at capacity factors instead, because I started with regular old thermal plants, you know. So the yield is this, and the capacity factor is this. Okay, and then now if we go down here, you could derive the performance ratio. In this case, the PV-sys didn't have it. It had kWh per meter squared per joule. Ça c'est en français. And then we uh, have in the how much actually hits the panel. We have pour NA. We have a 4.4 on average kilowatt hours per meter squared per joule. And then we multiply that by the 365 or 365.25 if you want to add the leap year. And we get a capacity factor that you would get if you had no losses, no temperature coefficient business, no things that's related to the panel specifically. This is all related purely to the amount of sunlight that hits the panel, the column, is that the whatever plane. And then you get the actual capacity factor. That's what we just did. Okay, and then the performance ratio you can compute as you could do this with the yield, I suppose, as well. You compute the actual divided by the theoretical amount, and that gives you an 84%, which is pretty high. I see lower performance ratios sometimes. All right, and okay, let's go back to our inputs. All right, and then for the battery inputs, this is the one that was really kind of a little confusing to me. How much does it really cost, and how can we compare different battery costs to one another? So he said he's buying eight batteries, and each battery cost, I've already told you that, 325 US. He said here's the amps and the volts to get the ultimately to get the kVA. I should have put the same power factor perhaps. And we get the capacity. And then I said, well, how long does it take to discharge the batteries? He said more, but I think 4 hours was for me was a reasonable time. And then we multiply this capacity by the hours for a single discharge, and we get the kilowatt hours. And then you can take the total cost of the batteries divided by the kilowatt hours to get the cost per kilowatt hour. And then you also need to reflect the efficiency. You can call this a round trip efficiency. If you put 100 in, you only get 80 out. And then the battery life is a really big deal. So that's all of our analysis. Now, what I did I'm putting this one on the website again, and look at this. I've got 170 slides on this, and it's actually kind of, all I did was go to the internet and steal some stuff. So not steal, I took it because it's free. Whatever, like you take my stuff, that's okay. And then I'm gonna just talk about how you use batteries for ancillary services, for bulk power, some terminology, and then I'm going to show you the cost. Okay, and you get all of this stuff, but it's hard to put it all together. That's what I'm trying to do in our simple little example. Okay, and I talk about ancillary services, and I talk about if there's hydro, the real cost. If you've got a hydro with a reservoir that you can operate in spinning mode, that means the generator is spinning around. It's operating kind of as a motor, not as a generator. Then you can just switch it around, and then the cost of ancillary services is nothing. But here's the problem. Here loads. This is South Korea loads, I think. They go up and down all the time, and then we have to figure out what this cost of the balancing is. Now here's a day by day. I forgot where this was. I think it's probably Scotland or something. And we suddenly have a cloud cover with the solar, and I don't know what the two I think one's with the performance ratio and one's without the performance ratio, and you suddenly get a cloud cover. And if you suddenly get a cloud cover here, you better have enough electricity capacity to switch on right when this cloud occurs. Here's a week by week, and we can see, oh, we thought we were going to have this much solar, and we actually had this, and then this cloud made us have zero. It's a very uncertain kind of thing. And what's the cost of that uncertainty? And can you use batteries to alleviate the cost of these ancillary services that you have to have in place to store this? Now, if you have a place that's got no clouds ever, that's much less of an issue, obviously. So you have to really think about what the cost of these ancillary services. Then when I look at wind, there's a wonderful website in Nord Pool, and I put this here as well. You know, you go to the energy analysis and you go to merchant electricity prices, and I try to collect all of these. This is one of my unfinished, many unfinished projects. And then somewhere down here, I have Nord Pool prices, and I try to explain how you go to these websites, you get the data, and how you update the data. And obviously, I'm not finished with kind of putting a little video on how you update the data for different places. Okay, now if you uh, uh, look at this, the nice thing about that website is they showed how much wind capacity you're getting on an hour by hour basis versus how much electricity you're producing. And you can even see kind of when we have more lower wind production here, then the price goes up. And again, the reason I use the Denmark case is because they have so much, because they're a nice place to visit too, but they have so much wind capacity, much more than just about any place else in not only in Europe, probably the world, as on a relative basis. So here our wind capacity goes down and our electricity price goes up. And this again relates to the ancillary services. How much variability is there in the wind, and how much does it really cost? It does seem to cost something. Well, obviously, the first cost is just a bulk power cost. When you produce less wind, the price goes up. I measured the price, by the way, in terms of an implied heat rate, not an absolute price, because the price of electricity varies with natural gas. Okay, blah blah blah. And then I tried to make a scatter plot. Oh, it's so fun. And then I have this famous in California they call it the duck pond. This is supposed to be a pond, and eventually with solar, you're going to if it's during the day and you have no clouds, you're going to have a big trough. A big trough. That's when it goes down like that in the middle of the day. And the difficult part of this is that you have to have your power plants ready to go, and they have to be ready to meet this plant. So you're going to have to get your power plants hot and ready to go. And how do you manage this now? If you had all this battery backup, maybe you could use this solar to just power all the batteries, or power all the batteries of your electric cars, and then alleviate that. So it's a nice kind of simple way to think about things. All right, and then the questions. There are a whole bunch of questions about how much it really costs for these ancillary services. Okay, and now then we go through the kind of the. I didn't finish some of this. The economics of the bulk power with batteries in any battery analysis. It comes down to how much the on peak, or how much the cost of the power is when you charge I'll call it the avoided cost, or the marginal cost of the power when you charge the battery versus the marginal cost when you discharge the battery. That's always the biggest factor. And I'm trying to look here at different this is in the Philippines. What's the cost of peak power versus off-peak power? And you can just run almost an hour-by-hour analysis. That's what I said. We really need an hour-by-hour analysis to do any of this. Okay. So here's some more theories on it. Now, what I'm trying to get to finally is really what a battery is. I think I've made another video where somebody rightfully said a battery is like a water tower where you pump up the electricity, you store it for 4 hours, and then you discharge it. This is the capacity. This is the storage amount. Okay, and then I kind of have some, how much is the value of having storage versus value of having capacity? It's a very tricky issue. I find it very tricky. In some situations, you want storage, more storage capacity. In others, you just care about moving it over very short periods, and then you care about capacity. It depends on how you're going to operate it. Now, most of these things I have, you operate it for you store it with sunlight, and then you want to store enough of it to discharge it at night. Then you need some storage capacity. In fact, you really need enough to, if you want to operate completely independently, you need enough storage capacity to store it all up from the few hours of sunlight, and then run your lights in the evening. Okay, and then we have this round trip efficiency, which is how much you get out compared to you put in, and the degradation and age are a gigantic deal, which I talked about. So I have all these little things where I try to find how much. Look, I haven't filled in everything. Now I wanted pictures of some of the batteries and how much they really cost. Okay, so we've got some flow batteries and some lithium batteries, and I just took some examples. And finally, putting the cost per kWh. That's where I'm coming down to fine. And this is for, doesn't say it is, but it must be for different types. But for lithium, they say the cost is, can it get down to 200? You're looking per kilowatt hour. What's the kind of cost? Can it get down to 100 per kilowatt hour? And what kind of cost would different batteries have? I compare that again to the thing I showed you before on the cost of solar, and will you have the same kind of pattern? We're looking at lead acid batteries right now, which have a short cost, but they also have a short lifespan. So that's kind of, the lifespan is extremely important in carrying charges and the economics of the battery. So even though enough, I think that's enough. I'm going to put this again on the website on this page where we go to energy analysis, battery analysis. I'm going to put it right here. I haven't put it there yet, and I have to finish it a little bit. Okay, and now let's go back to our inputs. I'm still babbling on about the inputs. Okay, and uh, uh, okay, and finally we have the important part. This is kind of like the cost of the grid power, the ancillary services, and so on and so forth. Even in this single place where we've got one house, one battery, one little thing of batteries, some solar panels on a rooftop, we could do two things. We could either, in Nigeria, people have backups. So, and here are the kind of costs of the backups. Now, if you have the batteries, maybe you don't have to replace your backup. Maybe even you don't even have to have one. Now, this was very interesting. Apparently, with the solar and the solar and the the solar and the battery, he didn't even have to hardly ever use it. So maybe he can avoid this cost. Maybe not. Okay, and then if you're going to do some analysis with diesel backup, you have to know how much the diesel price is and how much the avoided costs of not running the diesel are. And that's what you do. That's what you do over here. And finally, there are some periods in Nigeria where you have some backup from the grid. And all of these variables go into the payback kind of assumption. Now, if you in Nigeria, here's one of the kind of problems is, oh no, distribution financials. I'm not going to tell you exactly who this is, but I better press shift control like this. Oh, okay. And this, oh shit. The, the, this company had a loss that practically was the same as the revenues. Oh my God. The only way this situation is going to be rectified is they're going to basically have to double the distribution rates. So when you make your analysis, you can't just hold the distribution rates kind of flat. And then we got to put all sorts of inflation kind of assumptions. So now I'm just going to work through a couple of these things. Now I put the inputs in a little bit of a different color. And let's put the diesel costs, the cost of our diesel per liter. Okay, now I corrected it a little, and then we'll put the heat rate in terms of I'm going backwards all the time, the heat rate in terms of the kWh per liter, and then we're going to put an increase, and then we'll put the final cost per megawatt hour. I put per megawatt hour, not per kilowatt hour. This is just if you use the cost per liter after the exchange rate. I showed you a little data book with some backup on that, and you take the cost per liter, USD per liter, and then you multiply it by the you're going to have to reverse this and put liters per kWh or liters per MWH, and then you multiply those two things together, and you get the cost of the diesel. Okay, now that's only one thing. So then I've just said, okay, well, let's just increase this. Now that we have a situation where we should decide how long this project is going to last. So we actually should also put the lifetime of the solar panels. Okay, and I'm going to make another assumption here. So up here we need no, I don't know. 25 years seems to be a long time, but it's not that long. So again, Control Alt C. Part of this is to show you how the whole thing works, and then you excuse me, I changed the the sheet by accident. Okay, so I think up here my objective is to kind of come up with a way to put these in the right places. So let's put the lifetime here. No, we'll put it over here, I guess. So we'll put the lifetime here, and we'll get. Why did it? Okay. I have no idea what happened. I thought I just put 25 here. Okay. I didn't see what I did. And then we put our little switch in here. So we make this less than or equal to this. And then if you have it like this, it gives you a blue color because of the generic macros. And I'm just going to multiply that by 1. Shift Control R because I have the generic macro open, and I forgot to press the F4 here on this one, and then I press Control Alt C. Now if you do this, you have to press Control Alt C again. It doesn't automatically do that because the conditional formatting is really tough. to program. Well, not that tough for somebody good, but tough for me. Okay. And then you can, now the next thing is we'll put the cost of the grid power in. And this time I have an increase. I put it a little bit over here. And this was the starting cost. This came from the data inputs. And then we said, okay, well, after 1 year, I'm going to increase it by 50%. So I was actually kind of conservative, saying that's how much you need that to see how much you're going to save. This is the capacity, and then I put the capacity factor in. Shift control right arrow, shift control P. That's just a very simple little formatting macro that I put in the generic macros. Not a big deal, but you should kind of make your own on those. You can see that on a different page. So then we, as usual, multiply this together. Now, what I should also do is multiply this by our ones and zeros. Okay. And then we put in our the big thing is, the question is, if you, I'm sure, I doubt they have some fancy feed-in tariff that says if you don't have surplus solar during the day, so pretend you have some refrigeration, some refrigerators, and you do your, and I hope you don't have a dryer, it wastes so much electricity. And then you come home and you use more lighting, and you charge your computer or your cell phone and all that, but you don't use that much during the day. So if you have some solar power, maybe 20% of it will be wasted. And that's really so you're producing that solar power and not being able to use it. Maybe 30% is wasted. And that's the real benefit of the battery. That's why I don't have an hour by hour analysis here. I just have to make an estimate of how much you don't use. Unfortunately, you can't get around that kind of number. Okay, and then we get our net generation that we actually use. And let's just make sure it's switched off over here at the end. Okay, and then we have, well, how much do you save? How much is out of this energy? How much that you're producing of the solar power? Now, I did something really bad. What I'm doing here at first is uh, uh, just doing an analysis only from the solar without batteries. And then I'm going to add the battery into the analysis and see what changes with our battery analysis and what happens ultimately to the payback period if you have batteries and solar versus if you just had solar itself. So we can isolate and see if the value of the battery is helping you or hurting you. Okay, so once we have this gives us our let's say now the blah blah blah. I can't get a stupid word out of my mouth, but if the grid power really, really sucks, so we have to run our generator 70% of the time, you can see that the payback period went to be was a lower number. If the grid power is good and we only have to run our generator 20%, and remember, this is the time during the day during when the solar power is producing. This is the number, and that's why when I introduced the whole thing, I showed you hour by hour kind of analysis. This is the substitute for hour by hour kind of analysis to do you. So let's leave it at 30%, and I'm looking down here. Now that once we have this, we can say, here's the savings we get. This is just the cost of the diesel power and the cost of the grid power, and we since this is megawatt hours, we have to divide it by 1,000. That's how much we save from having our solar operation. Now, if of course this is lower, we would save more. If this is 0, if this is 40%, which is really high, then we would save less. And we can show you what happens to the payback period. Okay. And then finally, or I'm looking at the payback period, not the IRR. That's an interesting psychological phenomenon because for most people, the payback period is an easier number to interpret than the IRR. Okay, then we can put in our cost. Now, if we could do this, I'm dreaming here, but I want to dream like this. If we could get the cost down to 600 per kW, if in the US, oh, this horrible shit where you have the US, then it takes 16 years to pay back. You've got to get the cost down. You've got to get the cost. This is my big criticism and my beef. You can't be playing these stupid games. You got to get to the real cost. The cost is coming down in a revolutionary manner. You can't be paying these absurd prices and saying you're some kind of environmentalist or something like that. What a lot of shit. Get it down to 600 and then get the payback period down. That's what you really want to do. Now, they still had 1,000, which is okay. It's whatever. Who knows? It's putting profits in somebody's pocket, I'm sure. Okay. And they'll say, oh, we have to hire union electricians in Nigeria or something like that. Whatever. Okay, now let's add the analysis with the battery. Okay. Now, these are some of the parameters I've already discussed. Okay, and I think we should perhaps put the discharge time here, and then the capacity of the battery we can also put here. I hope we had the come on, it was right here. I guess I don't really use that. This is the how much you can store the energy, and then we have the battery cost, which was the cost per kilowatt hour, which looked really low, but remember this is an acid battery. It's not this one everybody wants to put in. And then this is the total battery cost. And then the battery efficiency. Again, I should have taken this. It looks like I already did. Took this from the data inputs. Now, if I would let's make this a green color for a minute. I'll make it like that. If I go to our sheet and press Control Alt C again for our coloring, if I take it from the tab of the sheet tab color, and if I reverse the background, this might be kind of overdoing it, then you can clearly see what comes from the input sheet. If you press Control Alt C again and you don't reverse the tab color background, then you can kind of hardly really see it. So I hope you understood what I meant by this reversed color background. Now, in this battery analysis, there are a couple of differences between the regular solar analysis. And in this regular solar analysis, where we didn't have any batteries, we had to understand how much during the solar periods, were we going to otherwise, if we didn't have solar, run the gensets. And if we and this is the converse. And the other thing we had to do, I'm reminding you, is we had to estimate how much surplus solar power was there. In other words, how much more solar power were we producing than our refrigerator and everything else? Okay, I'm just going backwards a little, and I apologize for that. And anyway, this payback function, I'm going to explain how we derive. Now, when we go through the battery, they have the same kind of thing, the cost of the diesel plus the cost of the grid power. This was just taken from above. And then we also have the cost of buying a new genset. Now, it might be the case that if we have a battery, we don't need a new genset. And in this case, we're going to include the savings. It might be the case that we do still need a genset because there are some periods where the battery just can't last a long enough time to serve us. We don't have enough storage. Um, uh, uh, and we still need a genset because of all this stuff of not running the blah blah blah, not running the battery, uh, not running the genset. We might want to use the battery when there's no electricity, and we don't want to get stuck without electricity. If we really need a genset still, we'd have to turn this off. Now, if you kind of look at our little summary here, we have a true and a false. By the way, this is just a simple, obvious kind of format control thing where you go to the developer and you go to insert and you find it. Okay, I've got all videos on that kind of stuff. Okay, it's a little bit of a gimmick, but not completely, I don't think. Okay, now, so let's put we still have the same solar production capacity, but this time notice we don't have any losses from the uh, we don't have any losses from not being able to use the solar. But if we use the solar all to power our battery, the amount we're left over depends on this efficiency of the battery. So if we need more solar to put in than the battery, since we have too many, I'm going to make this 85% efficient. Okay, and then that goes into this variable, and then 15%. We need 15%. The net production we actually get from our battery after we're all finished with charging the solar and then using the battery is almost only this. Okay, now it's totally possible that we don't need the battery 100% of the time, that we use some of the solar to charge the battery and some of it to service loads during the solar time. So that's a little tricky. And then the other thing is, once we have a battery, this was the percentage of time we would have run the genset during the solar production period, but now it may be, and maybe this was, in this case, maybe this was only 20%, because during the day, who cares, we're not home and all this, and then our payback period is 6.52 years. In this case, let's say we have 60% of the time, we're going to save our battery only, and we're going to buy grid power, and we're going to save our battery and use it 60% of the time for when we're for when we're running the genset. And in this case, here's our payback period, and we have a 23% return from our solar plus our battery versus a 15% just from the battery, just from the solar alone. Okay, you can see that, I hope you can see that these are the same kind of assumptions about going on an hour by hour basis, and realistically, who has time to do all of that? Now, if the final thing is we get our total energy savings, and we multiply those energy savings by the rates, so that's the total real value of the energy savings. Okay, and then we also might have some savings from not buying a genset, and that depends on how long the life of the genset is. And to do that, we just put a little MOD, which is a divide. We just divide the period by 5 and see if the remainder is 0, and then we put that's our little switch. Okay, perhaps I'm going to just make it my old true false switch. Okay. I don't have generic macros open. Well, that's pretty stupid. Pinning thing, and then you can see when exactly does the the genset need to be replaced. And in this case, I had 5 years for the genset, and I had 6 years for the battery. Okay, let's put another variable. Let's put the battery. Maybe we'll make it a more conservative case. We have to replace it every 4 years. Maybe that's more realistic. Okay, and H36. And that was a silly input, and I always go the wrong way here, and we should put all our inputs here. Okay, that was a little bit bad, and then we can see what happens now. If we still need our genset anyway, you can see what happens to the return, and the payback period kind of sucks in this case, because if the payback's less than the date at which you replace it, there's a problem. You can even put the cost of the replacement battery as decreasing. I'm not going to do that right now. We have a kind of a flat battery cost. At least I didn't put inflation in. Okay, and so maybe we can start looking at all of these variables, and we can start doing some sort of analysis where we look at what's the relative value of the battery. In this case, it wasn't much difference. We had a 15% return with just the solar, and a 14% return from the battery. Or if we look at it in terms of the payback, it's 6.4 years versus 6.5 years. Now, just one more thing. We get finally the net cash flow. This is the cost of the battery, cost of the solar, cost of the battery, less, in this case, the cost of the replacement that we have to make. Now, that one should have been also, it's an error, should have been multiplied by this true. So if we put it false, we don't get that savings. And actually, that's a really big deal if you don't have to replace the generator. Okay, then if you don't replace it, it seems to be a better strategy just to do this without the batteries. And then if you're lucky enough to have load where maybe you'll only use 5% of it, then you get a much better return without the battery than with the battery. Now, I was intending to go through and do a whole big sensitivity case where we look at all of the solar panel cost, the battery cost, the diesel cost, the grid price, and the efficiency and everything else, and then we put that into a sensitivity and a tornado diagram. And for now, I'm not going to do that. If you really want to, this file will be it will be on the website. I think I've shown it to you. It will be on the website, and it will be right in energy analysis, battery and storage analysis, energy analysis, battery and storage, modeling battery cost and operation. Okay, and now there's one other thing I do want to show you, and that's this payback function. So the last thing I would like to do on this is to show you how to get this payback function. Okay, this is a user-defined function. Now, to get this, what I just did is I deleted this function from the existing sheet. I'm going to redo it. So you go to the Excel and VBA and you look up UDFs for financial models, and you can have this depreciation, vintage, compute the volatility, XMIR, which is kind of stupid, make an EO quarter, make a dynamic goal seek, by the far most interesting one. You go to the payback function, and then you can download it or open it. Let's open it. And then once you open it, here's the process you go through. Now, I just fixed this. So if you tried it a little while ago and it didn't work, don't complain because I did this. And what you do is you just click once you get it. I went quickly, I think, but you click on this, all of this code, and then go back to your model, press alternate F8, and maybe we'll put payback and put function. This will create something, and then you'll know where it is later. Okay, and then you can paste it. Now, if you do this, there is something slightly, you should put option base 1 at the beginning of this. Okay, not at the end. This is for working through an arrays, and you can see how this thing works, and it's a payback function, and there's a discounted payback function and all that gives you the that gives you what it does. It gives you the fraction of the year in which the payback occurs. So if you would just use the kind of match function, you can match accumulated cash flow. You have to first compute the accumulated cash flow, then do it. For some odd reason, Excel doesn't have some function like this. Perhaps it's if you have multiple negative cash flows or something. I don't know why they really don't have that, but it just goes through and identifies the year and then works through the fractions of the year. Okay, so that's some ideas. Maybe it's not perfect, and you can really see just how even for a simple kind of analysis, the working through the economic analysis of really whether these batteries are a good thing or a bad thing is not such an easy task. And even when the energy price is really high and you get some good solar, the case is not overwhelming, and it depends on just so many variables. I'm putting 70% back in here, and I'm assuming you can replace this, and then we get a dramatically kind of different return. But you can see just what drives some of this analysis, and I hope you can see, you don't have to get into this extremely complicated things to work through it, but you do have to have some kind of framework to really incorporate all of these different variables. And I think I should shut up right now.